Our policy is not predicated on Castro surrendering power. What our policy is predicated on
is there anything short of Castro's surrender of power that will change U.S. policy towards Cuba?
You know, our policy is not predicated on Castro surrendering power. What our policy is predicated on is a democratic transition. It's not personal, and in fact, I would go so far as to say I'm an aficionado of what Osvaldo Payá said, one of the leading opposition members in Cuba, opposition leaders, I should say. Is he said he doesn't believe in biological fatalism. That is, that we're waiting for this one old dude to die so that we can press forward with democratic development in Cuba. I think democratic development in Cuba should take place today.
But first of all, we have to define the term democracy in their terms, because Osvaldo Payá had this Varela project in saying that in Cuba there was no democracy. The people in Cuba doesn't have freedom of speech. The people in Cuba doesn't have the right to raise their hands and say something against the government. It's not in that way. You can say anything you want in Cuba.
Okay, there is a Varela project, but the Varela project is something we see as subversion to our order. You have to count on the will of the Cuban people to say if we want this or not. There is a group of Cubans promoting this, but it was a big referendum in Cuba. Big referendum, and from the possible people voting, it was just I think about 300,000 or 500,000 persons, and it was 8.5 million people voting against this. It was a big referendum, and everybody went and signed.
Fidel Castro has been many years in power because the people want him to. In Cuba, there have been people that doesn't like the revolution, but they are not the majority. Because if the majority were against Fidel Castro, I assure you he won't be in power right now.
If we were authentically sure that the Cuban people were speaking for themselves, I would have a different view of that. If there were more than one political party, if there were effective observation of the elections, if there were a truly independent press, if there were all the markers of a free society, which we all know exist in other parts of the world but don't exist in Cuba, then I would feel more confident that the Cuban people were really speaking for themselves.
In Cuba, what we don't have is a several political party system, but we have elections, and in our point of view, they are free. The problem is first. There is no elections at all in Saudi Arabia, and there's no pressure against them to change their system. Why? We have to change ours. That's our problem. The problem is, here in Cuba, we have elections. In every neighborhood, we have a kind of county or circumscription, we call. And then we have a meeting of all the neighbors. And in this meeting, we propose the candidates. And then we know each other. If I love you, if I know the way you think, then I'm going to propose you, and I'm going to vote for you later. Yeah. The problem is, some people, they don't believe in this kind of elections because they just want their way to organize things. We can say what happened with the last elections in the United States. Because I was listening to this in the Voice of the United States of America because I wanted the Democrat candidate to win. And I was very deceived when I heard everything happening in Miami. It was in Miami the last decision. And for us, it's not democratic at all. And we are not the only doesn't agree with this kind of system. But it's the system you have. And we have to respect these systems. We can propose candidates against the government. But we don't do this because the majority of the Cuban people doesn't want to do this.
What President Bush said on May 20, 2002 was, hold one election. And not even a presidential election. Hold a National Assembly election, permit an opposition political party, here's a concept, permit international media to observe, permit international organizations like Carter Center to observe. You hold an election like that meets our standards, of the international standards defined in the Inter-American Charter of Democracy as being free and fair, and I'll move with Congress to lift the embargo and the travel restrictions.
Mr. Whitaker might be right if he can get the Helms-Burton Act rescinded, but it's still on the books. It's the law of the land. And it states quite clearly we cannot engage with any Cuban government that includes Fidel Castro or Raul Castro. And then there are a whole series of other conditions that must be met. So President Bush saying, well, he'd be willing to take a step or two if the Cubans would only hold the kind of elections that he wants. I'd like to see elections held in Cuba too. I'd like to see 2 candidates for each slot in the National Assembly, and I'd like to see an open nominating procedure and so forth. But I also understand that I would have more success in bringing that about by reducing tensions and beginning a dialogue with the Cubans, beginning to engage. There was a debate about that kind of election some 10 years ago, and the decision was made not to go to that kind of more open election because of continuing tensions with the United States and the fear that the CIA would be in taking advantage and distorting the elections in Cuba just as they had in Central America. And it's not a fear without a certain merit.